If you have reached the landing, please continue on to episode 5.
So we've now arrived at the landing, and this is really an amazing spot just to get a wonderful view of the harbor. And for us at Environment Hamilton, this is a really fantastic place for stack watching. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background before we get into the details of stack watching, and want to start with just some of the information worth noting around the steel sector in Hamilton and some of the incredible transformations that are going to be happening down there. So historically, people in Hamilton will know we've always had two integrated steel mills, Dofasco and Stelco, and once upon a time they were locally owned, and they've both that ownership has changed. It's particularly stark in the case of ArcelorMittal Dofasco. Dofasco is now owned by ArcelorMittal, which is the largest steel producer on the planet. Right now, Dofasco is still a fully functioning steel mill, and that includes primary steel production and a whole variety of high-tech finishing lines. Stelco is a little bit different. They still operate their coke oven and several finishing lines, but the rest of the primary production in between is no longer operational at their Hamilton works. They do all of that work at their Lake Erie plant, which is still a fully functioning mill. In the case of ArcelorMittal Dofasco, there have been announcements made recently around both federal and provincial funding in combination with funding from the company itself that's going to facilitate the transition of steelmaking at that plant to what is being dubbed green steel or carbon neutral steel. So it's a really exciting announcement. The plan is to complete that transition, or at least the really important first phase of it, by 2028. So we're talking over the next 6 years. And the reason why this is so important is because ArcelorMittal Dofasco is the largest stationary source of greenhouse gas emissions in the province of Ontario. So they are a massive contributor. So this change is really being driven by the climate crisis, the climate emergency. But another important thing to note is that with the transformations that are happening, we're going to see ArcelorMittal Dofasco leave behind that primary steel production where a lot of the pollution from steel making occurs. So we won't just benefit from reduced greenhouse gas emissions. We're also going to see the almost complete elimination of the emission of contaminants like benzene and benzoate-pyrene. These are both confirmed and potent human carcinogens that plague our airshed, particularly if you live closer to the industrial core, and other sources of pollution, particulate pollution, heavy metals, that sort of thing. So it's a really, really profoundly important transformation for that reason too. And what's going to happen is, right now in a steel mill like ArcelorMittal Dofasco that is still using the full primary production process, you'll have coke ovens that do what we've described in an earlier episode. They bake the coal to make coke. That then gets fed into blast furnaces and mixed in with iron ore and other ingredients to produce molten iron. And that molten iron is ultimately fed into a basic oxygen furnace or mixed with metal scrap in an electric arc furnace to produce steel slabs that then get rolled and made into various steel products. So those early stages, the coke ovens, the blast furnace, the basic oxygen furnace or electric arc furnace, those would no longer, with the exception of the electric arc furnace, those would no longer be necessary with this new approach to steel making, this carbon neutral approach. What we're going to see instead is something called direct reduced iron combined with a massive new electric arc furnace in order to make steel. And just very quickly, because this is important to understand, ultimately we're going to see that direct reduced iron process fueled by green hydrogen. The process will start when the new facility opens in 2028. with that DRI, or direct reduced iron process, being fueled by natural gas. But for sure, by 2050 at the latest, the company is telling us they will transfer over to green hydrogen. And then that's how molten iron will be produced. That will ultimately be fed into the electric arc furnace, and then into the continuous caster at the facility for steel making purposes. So it's a pretty major change and a pretty exciting one at ArcelorMittal Dofasco. So, having said all of that, we are still trying to encourage more Hamiltonians to stack watch, because in these intervening 6 years, we're really worried about how that primary production side of the plant is going to look. So far in 2022, for instance, the company has really been struggling again with visible emissions from stacks and other parts of their plant, mainly, pretty much exclusively from the primary production side of steelmaking. So it's really important that we all as community members stay vigilant, and we ensure that the company doesn't allow that part of the plant to just keep getting worse and worse and worse over the next 6 years as we work towards something that's going to be incredibly better. It just doesn't seem fair to the community to allow that to happen. So, Stack Watching 101, what does a dangerous emission look like? Well, we've tried to keep this simple, and so our advice to community members is that you should look for discoloration. Look for a black emission. That's what you'll most commonly see, but it could be brown, it could be purple, it could be green. The message is anything that looks discolored is, to you, when you look, using the naked eye, is likely something that's worth documenting and reporting. And so we have a sort of a 3-step process. We want you to be out there observing, so looking for that discoloration, documenting, so be sure when you're doing a stack watch walk to bring along your cell phone, or if you've got a camera that you like to use, a digital camera, that's great as well. And ultimately, we want you to be reporting, and reporting involves sharing what you've seen with the Provincial Ministry of Environment, and indicating to them that you're wanting to file a formal complaint about what you've seen. So when we're out there looking at visible emissions, we're basically talking about opacity. And opacity is really the percentage to which light is able to shine through anything. So if you imagine a really, really black emission from a stack, chances are if it looks jet black, that it's an emission that's exhibiting 100% opacity, and the opacity percentages go down from there. So the lighter the smoke, the lower that percentage opacity. And the way the ministry regulates, it gets complicated because they do some averaging over time, but generally speaking, anything that's 20% opacity or higher, they could well start to zero in on and pay attention to from a regulatory point of view. And that's useful for us because opacity that's 20% or higher is the opacity that starts to look discolored when you're viewing it with the naked eye. So while we're standing here, it's also worth just giving you a really general introduction to Hamilton's industrial skyline from this perspective, from the West Harbour perspective. There are really 3 main sections along the shoreline. There's that really the guts of the steel primary production, and we'll also talk about the basic oxygen furnace. And then we're going to finish off just by talking about some of the agri-industry that's here now. So looking towards the industry from where you're standing on the landing, you're going to be working from left to right. So from the left, you'll see Stelco's coke stack, and the best way to know which one it is, it's sort of at the far end, so at the furthest to the left, and watch for black or brown to come out of it, and you'll know that's where it is. Further north of that stack is the quench tower, where you may be wanting to watch for quench clouds from the coke coming out of Stelco's coke oven battery. And then moving along, off in the distance, you will see other stacks set further back that may have black emissions coming from them. And those are coke stacks that are based at ArcelorMittal Dofasco. At Arcelor, they still have several coke plants, and there are 3 stacks that you can often see black emissions coming out of. And then moving a bit further along, again off in the distance, there are blast furnaces at ArcelorMittal Dofasco that are still active. They're a bit challenging to see from the West Harbour. If you're interested to know what one looks like, there is one kind of wedged between Stelco's Quench Tower and their one remaining active coke stack. They're a sort of a funny looking structure with all kinds of pipes twisting and turning around, and kind of wider at the bottom and narrower at the top.
That's all for episode 5. Feel free to move slightly to the right of the landing and press play for episode 6.